Who did this?
Everyone in this room is running from him. I'm the only one who sees exactly what he needs.
I heard you needed a bride, Your Grace.
Who sent you?
The candles at the royal palace still burned that night, though nothing else remained of the celebration they were meant to crown.
Somewhere behind the gilded doors, a bride lay dead in her wedding chambers, and with her, an alliance the whole kingdom had bet its future on. Roderick Draven, the man they whispered about as the Ice Duke, stood over the ruin of everything he'd built. He did not weep. He did not rage. He simply went still, the way frost settles before a killing winter, and everyone in that palace understood that stillness was far more dangerous than any scream.
By morning, the court would be a battlefield of accusations.
By nightfall, his enemies would circle what they believed was a wounded man. They did not know Olivia was already watching from the shadows of the hall. She was no one important. A name half remembered, a face the court had long since stopped bothering to place. Illegitimate, overlooked, quietly erased from a family that never wanted her seen. But she had spent her whole life learning how to read a room full of people who refused to look at her, and tonight she read the Duke's ruin like a map. While the court scattered in panic, Olivia stepped forward. Not to offer comfort, not to offer condolences. She had come to offer herself. Her heart pounded so hard she was certain he could hear it over the chaos, but her voice, when it came, did not shake.
I heard you needed a bride, Your Grace.
The words hung in the ruined air like a blade unsheathed. Roderick turned. Slowly. His hand drifted, almost absently, to the dagger hidden beneath his coat, the way a man reaches for a weapon he has needed too many times before. His eyes, sharp enough to have unravelled a dozen conspiracies before breakfast, dragged over her, searching for the trap he was certain was coming. Because men like him were never approached without a reason. Women did not appear from nowhere in the wreckage of a murder unless someone had sent them. The silence stretched, thin and merciless, until finally he spoke, his voice low enough that only she could hear it, grinding as stone dragged over stone.
Who sent you?
Olivia did not flinch, but somewhere beneath the lace and the composure, a war had already begun. One she had not fully chosen, and one she was far from ready to survive. If you've ever been the one nobody noticed until the moment everything fell apart, you already know exactly why she stepped forward. Stay close, because the Ice Duke is about to learn that the girl he almost dismissed may be the only reason he survives what comes next. The morning had promised nothing but joy. Silk ribbons draped the palace columns. Musicians tuned their instruments in the gardens below. Servants moved through the halls with the particular urgency of people preparing for a day that would be remembered for 100 years, though none of them yet understood which kind of memory it would become. Lady Seraphine, the Duke's intended, had spent the morning laughing with her attendants as they fastened pearls into her hair. She was the daughter of a foreign prince, chosen not for love but for the alliance her marriage would seal, a bridge between two powerful houses that had been at odds for a generation. Roderick Draven had agreed to the union with the same cold precision he brought to everything, a transaction, not a romance. But even a transaction could hold its own kind of peace, and for the first time in years, the kingdom had begun to believe that peace might last. By noon, the chapel bells had not yet rung. By noon, a maid's scream tore through the east wing. Seraphine was found in her chambers, still in her wedding gown, her body arranged with a deliberate, chilling stillness, as though whoever had done this wanted her found exactly that way. No struggle. No forced entry. Only a single, unmistakable message left behind. This alliance would never be sealed. Word spread through the palace faster than fire through dry timber. Guests who had arrived in silks and jewels now stood frozen in the hallways, their celebration curdling into horror. Somewhere, a mother pulled her daughter away from the wing where the body lay. Somewhere else, a foreign ambassador was already calculating what this meant for his kingdom's treaties. And in the centre of it all, Roderick Draven stood over the body of the woman he was meant to marry in 3 hours, his face carved from the same stone as the ancient halls around him. He did not shout. He did not weep. He simply looked at her, and something in his eyes went out, like a candle pinched between 2 fingers.
"Who did this?" he said, not as a question, but as a promise.
No one in the room dared answer, because no one yet knew, and every guilty party in that palace had already begun rehearsing their innocence. The physician who examined the body confirmed what the guards already suspected. No wound. No blade. Only a faint discoloration at her lips, and a wine goblet overturned near the vanity, its contents long since soaked into the carpet. Poison, then. Quiet, deliberate, and precise, the signature of someone who understood exactly how much chaos a single death could unleash without ever needing to raise a weapon. Roderick's steward, a nervous man named Edmund, who had served 3 generations of Draven dukes, approached with visible dread. "Your Grace, the ambassador is asking." "Tell the ambassador his kingdom's alliance died with her," Roderick said, his voice flat and terrible. "Tell him I will send a formal apology once I have finished burying my future." Edmund did not move.
"Go," Roderick said, and the word cracked like a whip.
Within the hour, the foreign delegation had begun packing. Within 2, whispers of withdrawn support rippled through the noble houses who had aligned themselves with Dr. Raven on the strength of this marriage. Roderick's enemies, men who had spent years pretending friendship while waiting for exactly this kind of weakness, began sending their own quiet messages, testing which of his allies might now be persuaded to abandon him. By evening, the man who had walked into that palace as the most powerful duke in the realm walked out of it as something far more dangerous. A man with nothing left to lose. He rode back to his estate in silence, his guards flanking him like a funeral procession, and no one who saw his face that night dared to speak to him at all. Word of the murder reached the outer edges of the city by nightfall, carried on the lips of frightened servants and gossiping merchants, each version more twisted than the last. In a modest, half-forgotten townhouse on the poorer side of the noble district, one listener absorbed the news with a stillness that had nothing to do with grief. Olivia had been half a house, half a name, half a person for as long as she could remember. The illegitimate daughter of a minor lord who had never once looked at her with anything resembling warmth. She had grown up in the space between recognition and dismissal, present at family gatherings only long enough to remind everyone why she should not be there. Her stepmother had made certain of that. Her half-sisters had learned the lesson early and repeated it often. Olivia existed the way a shadow exists, necessary to the shape of the room, but never invited to sit at the table. She had learned to survive on scraps of attention and mountains of silence. She had learned to watch instead of speak, to calculate instead of feel, because feeling had only ever gotten her hurt. And so, when the maid burst into the kitchen with news that the Duke of Cinderwick's bride had been murdered on her wedding day, Olivia did not gasp with the others. She sat very still, turning the information over in her mind the way she turned over every piece of information that came her way, searching for the shape of opportunity hidden inside the tragedy. Her family's debts had grown unbearable. Her father, drowning in gambling losses he refused to acknowledge, had begun making arrangements that terrified her, quiet conversations with moneylenders, desperate letters to distant relatives, the particular kind of silence that preceded ruin. If the debts were called, as they surely would be within the month, the family would lose everything. Her stepmother would lose everything. Her half-sisters, who had never shown Olivia a single moment of kindness, would find themselves exactly as invisible as they had always made her feel. She should have felt satisfaction at that thought. Instead, she felt only the cold clarity of a decision already made. She rose from the table, ignoring the questions thrown at her back, and made her way to the small room she called her own, barely larger than a closet, tucked at the end of a hallway no one else bothered to walk. She stood before the cracked mirror and studied her reflection, searching for whatever it was that made people look through her instead of at her.
She found nothing. Perhaps that was the point.
If the Duke needed a bride, and every noble family with an eligible daughter was too frightened of scandal or assassination to offer one, then perhaps the invisible woman was the only one bold enough or foolish enough to walk directly into the centre of the storm. By the time she reached the palace grounds the following morning, the guards had already begun turning away every noble who arrived, hoping to offer condolences and quietly angle for the Duke's favour. Olivia had no invitation, no title worth mentioning, no reason at all to be allowed past the gate. She told the guard at the entrance that she carried information about the murder. It was, technically, not a lie. She had spent the entire carriage ride constructing a theory sharp enough to earn her a hearing, piecing together fragments of gossip about the ambassador's debts, the timing of the poison, the suspiciously convenient absence of 2 junior stewards on the morning of the wedding. She did not know if any of it was true. She only knew it needed to sound true enough to get her through the door. It worked, though not in the way she expected. Instead of an audience with a steward, she found herself swept into the wake of a furious procession. The Duke himself, moving through the palace corridors like a storm given human shape, flanked by guards who were struggling to keep pace with his fury. He was heading, she realized with sudden horror, toward the chambers of the ambassador's household, toward men who had nothing to do with the murder, but who made an easy, satisfying target for a man too consumed by grief to think clearly. She had seconds to decide.
She stepped directly into his path.
The guards reacted instantly, weapons half drawn, but Roderic's raised hand stopped them before they could reach her. He looked down at the woman who had appeared from nowhere to block the path of the most dangerous man in the kingdom, his expression flickering between disbelief and something far colder. "Move," he said, "or be moved." "You're about to make a mistake," Olivia said, her voice shaking despite every effort to steady it. "The ambassador's men didn't kill her." Something in his eyes sharpened. "And you know this because?" "Because the poison used was slow-acting and required proximity for at least an hour before her death," Olivia said, the words tumbling out faster than she intended, fueled entirely by desperation. The ambassador's men were in council with the foreign delegation the entire morning. "I heard it from 3 separate servants who have no reason to lie to each other. If you execute the wrong men now, whoever actually did this will simply watch you destroy your own alliance from the shadows, and they will still be free to strike again."
The corridor went utterly silent.
Roderick studied her the way a man studies a blade he does not recognize, searching for the maker's mark, the flaw, the hidden purpose. "Who are you?" he said, "and why should I believe a single word from a woman I have never seen before in my life?" Olivia felt the ground shifting beneath her moment, felt the entire trajectory of her future balanced on the next several seconds. She thought of her father's debts. She thought of her stepmother's contempt. She thought, strangely, of every time she had been dismissed, overlooked, erased, and something in her, something that had been quietly gathering strength for years, finally refused to stay silent. "I heard you needed a bride, Your Grace," she said. The words landed as a blade dropped onto stone. Roderick's hand drifted toward the dagger at his belt, an instinct so ingrained it seemed almost involuntary. His eyes raked over her, searching for the trap he was certain must be hidden somewhere in her words, in her posture, in the impossible timing of her arrival.
"Who sent you?" he said, each word measured, deliberate and dangerous.
"No one," Olivia said. "I came because I was the only one desperate enough or foolish enough to offer." He did not answer immediately. The silence stretched long enough that several of his guards exchanged uneasy glances, clearly expecting him to have her removed, or worse. But Roderick simply continued studying her, as though trying to determine which lie she was telling and which truth she was hiding beneath it. Finally, he spoke. "You will come with me," he said. "Not as my bride. As my prisoner, until I determine exactly which enemy sent you to my door." Olivia's stomach dropped, but she did not step back. "Then determine it," she said, "because I promise you, Your Grace, I am not the enemy you're looking for." He did not answer. He simply turned and walked, and the guards closed around her before she could take a single step of her own free will, sweeping her forward into a fate she had chosen and could no longer escape. The carriage ride to Cinderwick Manor took 3 hours, though Olivia would later be unable to recall a single mile of the journey. She sat across from the Duke in silence, aware of his gaze on her the entire time, though he never once spoke. The countryside blurred past the window, green hills giving way to darker, wilder terrain, until finally the manor rose out of the mist like something summoned rather than built. Towering stone walls, narrow windows like watching eyes, a fortress disguised as a home. The guards escorted her through the entrance, not to a guest chamber, but to a lower hall she suspected had not hosted a guest in decades. The room was cold, sparse, lit by a single lantern that cast long shadows across stone walls that seemed to absorb warmth rather than reflect it. Roderick entered without announcement, closing the door behind him with a finality that made her pulse spike.
"Sit," he said.
She sat. He remained standing, circling her slowly, the way a predator circles something it has not yet decided whether to trust or destroy. "Tell me your name."
"Olivia Ashworth."
"Ashworth," he repeated, testing the word as though it might reveal something hidden beneath its syllables. "I know that name." A minor house, drowning in debt, currently negotiating with 3 separate moneylenders to avoid public ruin. Olivia's breath caught, but she kept her expression carefully still. "You've done your research quickly." "I do my research before I speak to anyone," Roderick said. "You should have expected that. Then you already know I have no connection to whoever murdered your bride. I know your family is desperate enough to send its most disposable member into the heart of a murder, investigation on the vague hope that the man at the centre of it might marry her out of pity or convenience," Roderick said, his voice sharpening with every word. "What I do not know is whether that desperation was your own idea or whether someone else planted it in your mind, knowing exactly how useful a desperate woman can be when properly positioned." "No one positioned me," Olivia said, anger finally breaking through her careful composure. "I positioned myself. I have spent my entire life being told I don't matter enough to be noticed, let alone used as a weapon by anyone clever enough to plan a murder. If your enemies wanted a pawn, Your Grace, they could have chosen someone far more convincing than the family's forgotten bastard." Something shifted in his expression, so briefly she almost missed it. Not warmth. Not yet. But something that resembled curiosity. "Convince me," he said, "that you are exactly as unremarkable as you claim, and I will let you go home to your debts and your family's contempt. Fail to convince me, and you will remain here until I am satisfied you pose no threat to my life or my title. however long that takes. Olivia met his eyes, refusing to look away, though every instinct screamed at her to shrink beneath the weight of his scrutiny. "Then ask your questions," she said, "and I will answer every single one, because I have nothing left to hide and even less left to lose."
The interrogation lasted the entire night.
He asked about her family, her upbringing, her education, the precise nature of her relationships with each sibling, each servant, each distant cousin who might conceivably harbour a grudge against the crown or the Draven line. He asked about her movements over the past month, cross-referencing her answers against information his spies had already gathered, catching her in small inconsistencies born of exhaustion and fear rather than deception, and watching, always watching, for the larger lie he was certain must be buried somewhere beneath the small ones. By the time the first grey light of morning touched the narrow windows, Olivia's voice had grown hoarse, her hands trembled from cold and hunger, and yet something had shifted in the room that neither of them acknowledged aloud. She had not broken.
She had not begged.
She had answered every question with a steadiness that seemed to surprise him more with each passing hour, as though he had expected her resolve to shatter long before dawn, and its refusal to do so had become its own kind of evidence. "You may rest," Roderick said finally, his voice rough with the same exhaustion that had worn down her own. "We will continue this evening." "You still don't believe me," Olivia said. "I believe very little," Roderick said, "until I have exhausted every possibility of being wrong. It has kept me alive this long." He left without another word, and Olivia sat alone in the grey morning light, aware that she had survived the night, but far from certain she had won anything resembling safety. She was given a small chamber, plain but not unkind, and a servant who brought food she barely touched, too wounded with tension to eat. Sleep, when it finally came, was thin and restless, filled with fragmented images of the Duke's eyes, sharp and searching, and the memory of her own voice trembling as she insisted on her innocence. She woke to the sound of raised voices somewhere below her window. Curiosity, or perhaps the particular restlessness of a mind unable to stay still, drew her to the narrow glass. Below, in the courtyard, she saw Roderick in conversation with a man she did not recognize, tall, elegantly dressed, with the easy confidence of someone born into privilege and never once forced to question it. The stranger's posture was relaxed, almost affectionate, and yet something about the scene made the hair on Olivia's arms rise. She could not hear the words, but she could read the shape of the conversation, the way the stranger's hand rested briefly on Roderick's shoulder, the way Roderick's jaw tightened at the contact without pulling away.
Family, she guessed, or something close enough to it.
She would learn later that the man was Cassian Draven, the Duke's cousin and closest surviving relative, a man whose charm had opened more doors in the capital than his cousin's cold reputation ever could. For now, she knew only that something about his presence unsettled her in a way she could not yet name, a discomfort that would prove, in time, to be the most important instinct she had. That evening, the interrogation resumed, though its tone had shifted subtly. Roderick no longer circled her like a predator testing weakness. Instead, he sat across from her, his questions sharper, more precise, focused now not on her past, but on her observations of the palace during the hours immediately following the murder. "You said you heard about the poison's slow effect from servants," he said. "Which servants?" Olivia named them, describing each conversation with as much precision as she could recall. "And did any of them mention who had access to the ambassador's private wine stores that morning?" Olivia hesitated. One of them mentioned a steward who had been reassigned that same week, new to the household. No one seemed to know much about him. Roderick's expression sharpened. "Name? I don't know. Only that he was unusually quiet, and that several servants found it strange he'd been placed so close to the bride's private chambers despite having only just arrived. Roderick said nothing for a long moment, and Olivia watched something calculating move behind his eyes, a mind assembling pieces she could not yet see the shape of. "You will accompany me tomorrow," he said finally, "to speak with the palace steward directly. If your information proves accurate, it will be the first genuine lead in this entire investigation. And if it's inaccurate, then you will have wasted both our time," Roderick said, "and I will have one less reason to trust you."
You don't trust me now, Olivia said.
"No," Roderick agreed. "But I am beginning to find you useful, which in my experience is often the more dangerous quality of the two." The following afternoon, they returned to the palace under the guise of a formal condolence visit, though both of them understood the true purpose of the trip. Roderick moved through the grieving halls with the icy composure the court expected of him, accepting sympathies with brief nods, his eyes constantly scanning for the steward Olivia had described. They found him in a small records room near the kitchens, a nervous young man who startled violently when Roderick entered, his hands trembling as he fumbled to set down the ledger he'd been holding. "Your Grace," he stammered. "I wasn't told you would be." "You were recently transferred to this household," Roderick said, his voice deceptively mild. "From where?" The steward's eyes flicked toward the door, toward Olivia, toward anywhere but the Duke's face. "The Northern Estates, Your Grace. I was recommended by—"
By whom?
"By Lord Cassian," the steward said, and immediately seemed to regret it, his face draining of colour. Olivia watched Roderick's expression carefully. It did not change, not visibly, but something in the room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees. "My cousin recommended you personally," Roderick said, his voice still deceptively calm. "Yes, Your Grace," he said. He said the position would be a good opportunity, given my family's circumstances. And what circumstances would those be? The steward's hands were shaking now, badly enough that the ledger nearly slipped from his fingers. "Debts, Your Grace. My father's debts. Lord Cassian said he could help, if I proved myself useful in my new position." Something in Olivia's chest went cold. She had heard this story before, in a different voice, from a different desperate soul. Her own. A family drowning in debt. A powerful figure offering help in exchange for usefulness. The pattern was too familiar to ignore, and far too dangerous to dismiss as a coincidence. Roderick's questions grew sharper, more relentless, until the steward finally broke down entirely, confessing that he had been asked, only weeks before Seraphine's death, to memorize the layout of her private chambers and report any unusual visitors. He swore, weeping, that he had never been told why, that he had assumed it was simple palace security, that he had never imagined it might connect to murder. Roderick listened to every word without interruption, his face unreadable, and when the steward finally fell silent, exhausted by his own confession, the Duke turned and walked out of the room without a single word of reassurance or threat. Olivia followed him into the corridor, uncertain what she was meant to say. "Your cousin," she said carefully. "Is many things," Roderick said, his voice tight with a fury he was visibly struggling to contain. "A schemer. A gambler. A man who has spent years quietly building influence in places he believes I do not watch closely enough."
Do you believe he ordered the murder?
"I believe," Roderick said, stopping abruptly and turning to face her, "that I have spent my entire life underestimating the people closest to me, and I am done making that mistake." He studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. "You found this thread when my own investigators found nothing," he said. "That is either the greatest coincidence of my life, or you possess an instinct for uncovering exactly the kind of danger that surrounds me." Perhaps, Olivia said quietly, it's because I spent my whole life learning to notice the people no one else bothers to look at. The forgotten steward. The overlooked daughter. We tend to see each other, Your Grace, even when no one else sees us at all. Something in his expression softened, so briefly it might have been imagined. Come, he said. There is more to uncover, and I find I would rather have your instincts beside me than working against me. It was not trust. Not yet. But it was, Olivia realised with a strange, unfamiliar warmth, the first time in longer than she could remember that someone had chosen to keep her close simply because her presence had value, not because she was owed, not because she was pitied, but because she was needed. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm neither of them had chosen but both had quietly begun to accept. Olivia was no longer confined to the cold chamber where the interrogation had begun. She was given rooms befitting a guest, though guards remained posted at her door with an insistence that reminded her, whenever she forgot, exactly how precarious her position remained. She spent her mornings in the manor's vast library, poring over correspondence Roderick had permitted her to examine, searching for patterns among the names of merchants, moneylenders, and minor nobles who had recently found themselves suddenly, suspiciously solvent. She spent her afternoons in quiet conversation with the household staff, coaxing information from servants who had learned, through years of practice, to become invisible in the presence of power, a skill Olivia understood intimately, and one that made them far more willing to speak honestly with her than they ever had with Roderick's official investigators. It was during one such afternoon, examining the household's wine stores at Roderick's request, that she noticed something the palace physicians had entirely overlooked. A particular vintage, recently delivered, bore a wax seal subtly different from the household's usual supplier, nearly identical, but for a single detail in the emblem's engraving that would have gone unnoticed by anyone who had not spent years learning to notice the small imperfections others dismissed. She brought the bottle directly to Roderick's study, her hands trembling with the weight of what she suspected. "This isn't from your usual merchant," she said, setting the bottle carefully on his desk. Roderick examined the seal, his expression darkening as he recognized the discrepancy she had identified. "How long has this been in the cellar?" 3 days. Delivered as part of a shipment meant for tonight's household dinner.
My dinner, Roderick said quietly.
Yes. He was silent for a long moment, studying the bottle with the particular stillness of a man calculating exactly how close death had come without his knowledge. "You're certain of this?" "I'm certain the seal is wrong," Olivia said. "I can't be certain what that means without testing the wine itself, and I would strongly advise against anyone drinking it to find out." Roderick called for his physician immediately, and within the hour, the wine was confirmed to contain a poison nearly identical to the one that had killed Seraphine. Slow-acting, difficult to detect, designed to kill quietly enough that its victim might simply appear to have succumbed to illness rather than murder. The revelation transformed the atmosphere of the entire household. Guards doubled at every entrance. Meals were tasted before being served. Roderick's easy confidence, already strained by grief and suspicion, sharpened into something far colder and more dangerous. A man who now understood, beyond any doubt, that the enemy hunting him was close enough to reach his own dinner table. Someone within these walls delivered that shipment. Roderick said that evening, pacing the length of his study while Olivia watched from the window seat, her arms wrapped tightly around herself against a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "Someone with access to my household supply routes. Someone I have trusted for years. Or someone recently placed here," Olivia said carefully, the way the steward was placed in the palace. Roderick stopped pacing. "You believe my cousin has agents within my own home?" "I believe," Olivia said, that whoever wants you dead is patient enough to plant seeds months in advance and confident enough to believe you'll never notice until it's too late. The steward proved that pattern once already. I would be very surprised if it wasn't repeated here. Roderick was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight with a fury he seemed determined to master rather than release. You have saved my life twice in the span of a week, Lady Olivia. Once by stopping me from executing innocent men, and now by finding a poison my own household failed to detect. I've done nothing more than pay attention, Olivia said. Anyone could have noticed, if anyone had bothered to look. And yet no one did, Roderick said, except you. He crossed the room and stood before her, closer than he had allowed himself to stand since the night of the interrogation, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite every effort to remain composed. I have spent my entire life believing that trust is a weakness, he said quietly. That the moment I allow someone close enough to matter, I hand them the exact weapon they need to destroy me. And now? Olivia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Now, Roderick said, I find myself wondering whether the greater danger has always been trusting no one at all. The moment stretched between them, fragile and unfamiliar, until the sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor shattered it entirely. Roderick stepped back, his expression sliding back into its careful, guarded stillness, and Olivia felt the loss of that brief warmth more sharply than she wanted to admit. The following week brought an invitation neither of them could refuse, a grand ball hosted by the Crown itself, ostensibly to reassure the court that the kingdom remained stable despite the tragedy, but understood by everyone with sufficient political instinct to be exactly what it truly was, an opportunity for every ambitious noble in the realm to gauge the Duke's weakness, and perhaps, for whoever had orchestrated Seraphine's murder, an opportunity to finish what they had started. You cannot attend alone, Olivia said, when Roderick informed her of the invitation over a quiet breakfast. Every enemy you have will be watching for exactly that, a grieving Duke with no allies, ripe for manipulation or attack. And your suggestion? Roderick asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Bring me, Olivia said. Not as a prisoner. As a woman being quietly courted, a possibility the court can whisper about, a distraction sharp enough to draw attention away from your actual investigation. Roderick studied her for a long moment. You would be placing yourself directly in danger. If whoever orchestrated Seraphine's death believes you are becoming genuinely important to me, you become a target as surely as I am. I've been a target since the moment I offered myself to you in that corridor, Olivia said. The only difference now is that I would rather be a target who knows exactly what's coming than one who's caught unprepared. Something flickered across Roderick's expression, an emotion he seemed determined not to name. Very well, he said finally. But you will follow my lead precisely, and you will trust nothing said to you within those walls, no matter how harmless it seems. I've spent my entire life distrusting kind words, Olivia said. This will hardly be a difficult adjustment. The ball took place 3 nights later, and the palace had been transformed for the occasion into a glittering spectacle designed to project strength the crown did not entirely possess. Chandeliers blazed overhead, their light catching on jewels and silk as the court's most powerful families gathered beneath painted ceilings, each conversation a careful performance of confidence masking private calculation. Olivia had never worn a gown so fine in her life. The dressmaker Roderick had summoned had outfitted her in deep emerald silk, its cut elegant enough to command attention without announcing wealth she did not possess, and as she descended the grand staircase on the Duke's arm, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes settling on her at once, assessing, calculating, whispering. The forgotten Ashworth girl, she heard someone murmur behind a fan. On the Duke's arm of all people. Desperate men make desperate choices, another voice replied, low and amused. Olivia kept her expression perfectly composed, exactly as she had practiced in the mirror the night before, and felt Roderic's hand tighten briefly around hers, not in comfort precisely, but in something that felt remarkably close to solidarity. "They will underestimate you," he murmured, low enough that only she could hear. "Use it." "I've had considerable practice," Olivia said. They moved through the ballroom together, performing the delicate choreography of a courtship neither of them had chosen but both understood the necessity of, exchanging pleasantries with nobles whose smiles never quite reached their calculating eyes. Olivia watched every interaction with the same careful attention she had learned from a lifetime of being overlooked, cataloguing who watched them too closely, who avoided eye contact entirely, who seemed genuinely surprised by the Duke's apparent interest, and who seemed instead entirely unsurprised, as though they had expected exactly this. Cassian Draven found them near midnight, his charm as effortless and unsettling as it had been in the courtyard weeks before. "Cousin," he said warmly, though his eyes lingered on Olivia with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "And the lovely Lady Olivia. The whole court is speaking of nothing else." "Then the court has remarkably little to occupy itself with," Roderick said, his tone perfectly pleasant despite the coldness beneath it. "Perhaps," Cassian said, his smile never wavering. "Or perhaps they simply recognize a story worth telling when they see one. The forgotten daughter and the Ice Duke, finding warmth in the ashes of tragedy. It's practically poetry." "Poetry requires imagination," Olivia said. "I assure you, Lord Cassian, there is nothing imagined about my presence here." Something flickered behind Cassian's eyes, gone before she could name it. "No," he said softly. "I don't imagine there is." He excused himself moments later, disappearing into the crowd with the same easy grace with which he'd arrived, and Olivia felt Roderic's grip on her hand tighten almost imperceptibly. "He suspects something," she said quietly. "He suspects everything," Roderick said. "The question is whether he suspects the truth or merely enough to become dangerous." They had barely a moment to process the exchange before the orchestra shifted into a waltz, and the crowd around them parted expectantly, every eye in the ballroom turning toward the Duke and the woman on his arm, waiting to see whether the whispered courtship would prove itself real on the dance floor. Roderick extended his hand, and Olivia understood, with a sudden lurch of nerves, that refusing was no longer an option available to either of them. They moved into the dance with a stiffness born of unfamiliarity, but as the music swelled and the steps grew more familiar, something in their movement began to shift, a rhythm neither of them had planned but both, gradually, began to trust. Roderic's hand at her waist was steady, warm despite his reputation for coldness, and when their eyes met across the careful distance of the dance, Olivia felt something in her chest tighten that had nothing to do with fear. "You dance better than a prisoner should," Roderick murmured. "You lead better than a suspect should," Olivia replied. Something that might almost have been a smile touched the corner of his mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared, but she had seen it, and the memory of it lingered long after the music ended. It was in the final measures of the dance that Olivia noticed him. A man near the edge of the ballroom, dressed in the uniform of palace staff but standing with none of the deference that role required, his eyes fixed not on the dancers in general, but on Roderick specifically, tracking his movements with an intensity that had nothing to do with admiration. His hand rested inside his coat, in a position Olivia recognized immediately from years of watching her own father hide weapons from creditors. "Roderick," she breathed, her entire body going rigid. He followed her gaze instantly, his own expression sharpening the moment he registered the same threat she had. "Stay close to me," he said, his voice dropping into something low and commanding. "Whatever happens, do not run." The man moved the moment he realized he'd been noticed, pushing through the crowd with sudden, violent purpose, and the elegant, glittering ballroom erupted into chaos as guests screamed and scattered, guards shouting orders that were instantly drowned in panic, and somewhere in the center of it all, a blade caught the candlelight as it was drawn free. Roderick pulled Olivia behind him without hesitation, his own dagger already in hand. And for the first time since she had stepped into that corridor and offered herself as his bride, Olivia understood with terrifying clarity that the danger surrounding this man was no longer a distant threat discussed in careful whispers. It was here. It was now. And whether either of them survived the next several minutes would depend entirely on how quickly they could move, how completely they could trust each other, and how many more enemies were hidden among the glittering, terrified crowd still watching to see exactly how the Ice Duke would fall. The assassin never reached them. Roderick's guards converged from 3 directions at once, tackling the man to the marble floor before his blade could find its mark, and within seconds the ballroom's chaos resolved into a tense, murmuring silence as the would-be killer was dragged away, screaming denials that convinced no one. Olivia stood frozen at the center of it, her heart still hammering against her ribs, Roderick's arm still braced protectively in front of her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, turning to face her, his hands finding her shoulders with a gentleness that felt strange coming from a man who had just drawn a blade without hesitation. "No," Olivia said, though her voice betrayed the tremor she couldn't fully suppress. "But someone in this room ordered that. Someone is still standing here, smiling, pretending to be as frightened as everyone else." Roderick's eyes swept the crowd, cataloguing faces with the same cold precision he brought to everything, and Olivia watched him find Cassian near the far wall, his expression arranged into perfect, practiced concern.
"We leave," Roderick said. "Now."
They did not speak again until the carriage door had closed behind them, sealing out the chaos of the palace grounds, and even then, Olivia found herself unable to voice the fear still lodged in her throat. Roderick reached across the small space between them and took her hand, his thumb tracing slow, absent circles over her knuckles, an unconscious gesture that seemed to comfort him as much as her. "You didn't run," he said quietly.
You told me not to.
"Most people run anyway," Roderick said. "Fear rarely listens to instruction." "I've spent my whole life being told to make myself smaller," Olivia said. Running would have meant giving them exactly what they wanted. Roderick said nothing, but his grip on her hand tightened, and neither of them let go for the remainder of the ride home. The following days passed in a haze of heightened security and quiet, simmering dread. Guards tripled at every gate. Every servant's history was re-examined, every delivery inspected twice before it crossed the manor threshold. Olivia found herself restless within the fortress that had become her prison and her sanctuary in equal measure, unable to settle into the library's usual comfort, unable to shake the memory of candlelight catching on a drawn blade. It was during one such restless afternoon, wandering a wing of the manor she had never explored, that she found the door. It was tucked behind a tapestry so old its colours had faded to whispers of themselves. A narrow passage that led to a room clearly sealed for years, thick with dust and the particular silence of forgotten things. Olivia knew she should turn back, knew the household's current tension made exploring unfamiliar corners of the manor a poor decision, and yet something about the room's stillness drew her forward anyway. Inside, beneath a moth-eaten dust sheet, she found a small writing desk, and within its locked drawer, prized open with more determination than grace, a leather-bound diary that made her breath catch the moment she saw the initials embossed on its cover.
Her mother's initials.
Olivia's mother had died when she was young enough that memory offered only fragments. The scent of lavender, a soft humming voice, hands that had once, briefly, felt like safety. Her father had never spoken of her beyond the barest necessity, and her stepmother had made it clear from the beginning that the subject was forbidden entirely. She had never once imagined her mother's diary might be hidden in the home of a duke she had known for less than a month. With trembling hands, Olivia opened the first page, and the words within unravelled everything she thought she understood about her own existence. Her mother had not been a minor lord's mistress, as she had always been told. She had been born into a noble line far older and more powerful than the Ashworth name. A house destroyed decades earlier in a political purge so thorough that its very existence had been erased from most official records. The diary spoke in careful, coded language of a family betrayed by those closest to them, of a fortune and a bloodline deliberately extinguished by rivals who feared the influence it commanded. Olivia's hands shook as she turned the pages, piecing together a truth that reshaped everything she had believed about her own worthlessness. She was not simply an illegitimate daughter, unwanted and unclaimed. She was the last surviving heir of a line someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to destroy, hidden and disguised precisely so that no one, including her, would ever uncover what she truly was. The final entry, dated mere weeks before her mother's death, contained a single line that chilled her to the bone. "They have found me, and I fear they will not stop until every trace of our name is gone." Olivia sat in that dusty, forgotten room for a long time, the diary trembling in her hands, understanding with sudden, terrible clarity that her arrival in Roderick's life had never been the coincidence either of them believed it to be. Whoever had murdered Seraphine, whoever had planted poison in Roderick's wine cellar, whoever had sent an assassin into a crowded ballroom, they might have known, long before she did, exactly who and what she truly was. She found Roderick in his study that evening, the diary clutched against her chest like a shield. "I need to show you something," she said, "and I need you to understand that I had no idea any of this existed until an hour ago." He read the diary in near total silence, his expression shifting through disbelief, calculation, and finally something that looked remarkably like alarm. "This changes everything," he said finally, closing the worn cover with careful hands. "If this is true, if your mother's line still carries legal claim to resources and territories that were seized decades ago, then you are not simply an inconvenient houseguest, Olivia. You are a political weapon, whether you intended to become one or not." "I never wanted any of this," Olivia said, her voice raw. "I only wanted to save my family from ruin." "I know," Roderick said, softer than she expected. "But intention rarely determines danger. Whoever destroyed your mother's family did so because her bloodline threatened their power. If they learn you're alive, and that you know the truth, they will not hesitate to finish what they started decades ago." The realization settled over the room like a shroud, and Olivia felt, for the first time since arriving at Cinderwick Manor, the true weight of what she had walked into. She was no longer merely a suspect in someone else's conspiracy. She was, quite possibly, its final intended victim. A few days later, Roderick insisted she begin training with the household's weapons master, a gruff, scarred veteran named Garrick, who had served 3 generations of Draven dukes and answered to no one's authority but Roderick's own. Olivia protested at first, uncertain what use a dagger could possibly serve against enemies capable of orchestrating royal assassinations and infiltrating fortified manors. But Roderick's insistence brooked no argument. "You cannot rely on luck and quick thinking forever," he said. "The next enemy who finds you may not give you time to talk your way free." The training sessions began in the manor's private courtyard, early each morning before the household fully woke, and though Olivia arrived each day expecting only exhausting, humiliating failure, she found instead a strange, unfamiliar satisfaction in the discipline of it, the repetition, the small daily improvements, the sense of building something within herself that no one could simply take away. Roderick began joining the sessions himself after the first week, not merely to observe but to correct her form directly, his hands adjusting her grip on the blade, his voice low and patient in a way that contrasted sharply with the cold authority he showed the rest of the world. It was during one such session, his hand guiding her wrist through the proper angle of a defensive strike, that she became suddenly, acutely aware of how close he stood, of the warmth radiating from him despite the morning chill, of the way his breath had gone quiet and careful.
He said, his voice rougher than usual.
I have a good teacher, Olivia said, and immediately felt foolish for how breathless the words sounded. Roderick's hand lingered on her wrist a moment longer than the lesson required. When she turned to look at him, she found his eyes already on her face, searching for it with an intensity that had nothing to do with combat instruction. Olivia, he said, and something in the way he said her name, low and uncertain, made her pulse stutter. Neither of them moved for a long moment, the space between them charged with something neither had permitted themselves to acknowledge until now. Finally, slowly, as though giving her every opportunity to step away, Roderick lifted his hand to her face, his thumb brushing gently along her jaw. I told myself I would never allow anyone close enough to become a weakness, he said quietly. And yet here you are. I'm not trying to be your weakness, Olivia whispered.
I know, Roderick said. That's what frightens me most.
He kissed her then, gently at first, as though testing whether the moment was truly real, and Olivia felt every carefully constructed wall she had built around her own heart begin to crumble at once. For the first time in her life, she felt entirely seen, entirely wanted, not for what she could offer or what use she might serve, but simply for who she was. The moment shattered as quickly as it had formed. A guard's voice called urgently from the courtyard entrance, and Roderick pulled back immediately, his expression sliding back into careful composure even as his eyes remained locked on hers a moment longer, silently promising the conversation was far from finished. But the interruption carried news that stole every remaining shred of warmth from the morning. Your Grace, the guard said, breathless from running, Lord Cassian requests an urgent audience. He says he has proof of a traitor within your household, and he insists the evidence points directly to Lady Olivia. The accusation detonated through the manor like a struck match against dry timber. Cassian arrived within the hour, his expression a masterwork of solemn regret, carrying with him a servant's blood-stained ledger and a story that fit together with suspicious, damning precision. A loyal steward, one who had served the household faithfully for over a decade, had been found dead in the wine cellar that very morning, his throat cut, his hands still clutching a torn scrap of parchment bearing Olivia's handwriting. I found this among his belongings, Cassian said, his voice heavy with false sympathy as he presented the evidence to Roderick. A note detailing the location of poison meant for your cellar, cousin. In her hand. He must have discovered her plan and paid for it with his life. That's impossible, Olivia said, horror closing around her throat like a fist. I've written nothing of the kind. I've never even spoken with that man beyond passing greetings in the hallway. And yet the handwriting matches yours precisely, Cassian said, his eyes glittering with something that might have been triumph carefully disguised as regret. Perhaps the diary you discovered wasn't the only secret you've been hiding, cousin. Perhaps her sudden arrival, so conveniently timed with Seraphine's murder, deserves closer examination than either of us initially gave it. Roderick's expression remained frozen, unreadable, and Olivia felt panic claw its way up her throat as she watched doubt flicker, however briefly, across his features. You cannot believe this, she said, turning to him directly. Roderick, please, you know me. You know I would never. I know what I've seen with my own eyes, Roderick said, his voice carefully neutral, though something in his tone had gone cold in a way that terrified her more than any accusation. And what I've seen is a note in handwriting that matches yours, discovered beside a murdered man who served this household faithfully for years. Then someone forged it, Olivia said desperately. Someone who wanted exactly this, who wanted you to doubt me at the precise moment it would do the most damage. Cassian's expression shifted into something almost pitying. It's a convenient defense, cousin, but forgery of this precision would require extraordinary skill and extraordinary motive. Who among us would benefit from framing the woman you've grown so fond of? The question hung in the air, poisoned with implication, and Olivia understood with sudden, sickening clarity exactly what Cassian was doing. He was not merely accusing her of murder. He was planting a seed of suspicion designed to isolate her entirely, to sever the fragile trust she had spent weeks building with Roderick, to leave her utterly alone and defenseless at the exact moment his true plan required it. Confine her to her chambers, Roderick said finally, until I have determined the truth of this matter.
The words struck Olivia like a physical blow. Roderick.
Please, he said, and for just a moment, something raw and conflicted broke through his careful composure. I need time to think. Guards escorted her from the room, and Olivia walked the long corridor to her chambers with her chest hollowed out by a grief she hadn't expected to feel so sharply, not merely at the accusation, but at the devastating realization that the man who had, mere hours earlier, kissed her with such tenderness, now looked at her as though she might be exactly the enemy he had always feared. Alone in her chambers, locked behind guards who would not meet her eyes, Olivia forced herself to think clearly despite the panic threatening to overwhelm her. She thought of every interaction she'd had since arriving at Cinderwick Manor, searching for the moment her handwriting might have been studied closely enough to forge, and her mind settled, with sudden certainty, on the letters she had written weeks earlier, requesting books from the household library, letters that had passed through several hands before reaching the librarian, any one of whom might have copied her script with sufficient patience. She thought too of Cassian's easy access to every corner of this household, his years of quiet influence, his suspiciously convenient recommendation of the steward who had planted poison in the ambassador's palace weeks earlier. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone willing to see it clearly. The question was whether Roderick, wounded and doubting, would allow himself to see it at all.
She did not have to wait long for her answer.
Late that night, long after the household had gone quiet, Olivia heard the soft click of her chamber door unlocking and turned to find Roderick standing in the doorway, his expression exhausted, conflicted, stripped of the careful composure he wore for the rest of the world. I spent the evening examining the note myself, he said quietly, stepping into the room. The forgery is skilled, but not perfect. Whoever wrote it pressed too hard on certain letters, the way someone unfamiliar with a hand naturally would when concentrating too closely on mimicking it. Relief flooded through Olivia so suddenly that her knees nearly buckled. You believe me. I never stopped believing you, Roderick said. I needed time to prove it beyond doubt, because the moment I move against my own cousin without absolute certainty, I hand him every excuse he needs to claim persecution and rally sympathy against me. I am sorry for the hours you spent locked in here believing otherwise. It was necessary, and it was cruel, and I regret that both were true at once. You could have told me your suspicions, Olivia said, though the anger in her voice had already begun softening into something closer to relief. I could have, Roderick agreed. But if Cassian has eyes within these walls, and I now believe he does, any hint that I doubted his accusation would have reached him before I finished gathering proof. I needed him to believe he'd succeeded, at least for a few hours.
And now?
Now, Roderick said, his voice hardening with resolve, I intend to let him believe he's still winning, right up until the moment his entire conspiracy collapses around him. 3 days later, an invitation arrived at Cinderwick Manor that neither of them could have anticipated, though both immediately understood its danger. Cassian, apparently satisfied that his scheme against Olivia had succeeded in driving a wedge between the household's two most dangerous obstacles, extended a formal invitation for a private political conclave, ostensibly to discuss the kingdom's fractured alliances in the wake of Seraphine's murder, to be held within the ancient secretive halls of Cinderwick Castle itself, the Draven family's original ancestral fortress, long since abandoned in favour of the more modern manor. Roderick's spies confirmed within hours what both of them already suspected. The conclave was a trap, meticulously planned, designed to gather every remaining threat to Cassian's ambitions within a single isolated location, far from the reinforced security of the manor, where a coordinated assault could accomplish in a single night what months of poison and forged letters had failed to achieve. We could refuse, Olivia said, though she already understood from the set of Roderick's jaw that refusal was never truly an option. Refusing confirms we suspect him, Roderick said, and gives him every reason to abandon subtlety entirely. Number. We attend. But we attend prepared, and we make certain that whatever trap he's built for us becomes the very evidence that destroys him. The days leading up to the conclave passed in careful, urgent preparation. Roderick's most trusted guards were smuggled into the castle grounds days in advance, disguised as servants and tradesmen, positioned throughout the ancient fortress's crumbling halls. Olivia, drawing on the Diaries' fragmented references to her mother's family history, spent hours in the manor's oldest records searching for any mention of Cinderwick Castle's original architecture, and found, buried in a survey commissioned generations earlier, references to a network of forgotten passages built into the fortress during a more paranoid era of the Draven family's history, passages that had not appeared on any modern map. If Cassian's men attack, she said, spreading the ancient survey across Roderick's desk, these passages could let your guards move through the castle without ever being seen. It could mean the difference between an ambush he controls and one that turns against him entirely. Roderick studied the map with the particular intensity he reserved for matters of genuine consequence, and when he looked up at her, something in his expression had shifted permanently, an acknowledgement that had been building since the moment she first stepped into his path in a palace corridor weeks earlier. You have saved this household more times than I can count, he said quietly, and I have repaid you with suspicion and confinement. Whatever happens at that castle, Olivia, I need you to know that I see you now for exactly what you are. Not a suspect. Not a convenient political tool. The single most capable ally I have ever had beside me. Then let's make certain we both survive to remember you saying that, Olivia said, though her voice trembled with an emotion she made no effort to hide. They arrived at Cinderwick Castle on a night thick with fog, the ancient fortress rising out of the mist like something summoned from a darker era, its towers half swallowed by shadow, its windows glowing with the deceptive warmth of candlelight. Cassian greeted them at the entrance with his usual practiced charm, though Olivia noticed, with the same careful attention that had served her so well throughout the ordeal, the way his eyes flickered toward the tree line whenever he believed no one was watching. The conclave began innocuously enough, a gathering of minor nobles and disgruntled political figures airing careful grievances about the kingdom's fractured alliances, though Olivia could feel the tension coiled beneath every polite exchange, a room full of people waiting for something neither she nor Roderick could yet name. It was well past midnight when the first scream tore through the castle's lower halls. The conclave dissolved into instant chaos as armed men poured through the castle's main entrance, their faces covered, their purpose unmistakable. Roderic's guards, positioned throughout the fortress in the disguises they'd carefully maintained for days, moved into action immediately, but the sheer number of attackers made clear within seconds that Cassian's plan had been building toward this moment for far longer than either of them had realized.
"The passages!" Roderick shouted over the rising chaos, gripping Olivia's arm. "Now!"
They fled through a hidden door, concealed behind a tapestry nearly identical to the one that had led Olivia to her mother's diary weeks earlier. Plunging into darkness thick with dust and the particular cold of stone that had not felt sunlight in generations. Behind them, the sounds of battle echoed through the castle's ancient halls. Steel against steel, shouted orders, the particular chaos of a plan meeting resistance it had not anticipated. The passage forked without warning, and in the darkness and confusion, a group of attackers who had discovered the same hidden route separated Olivia from Roderick entirely, a wall of armed men surging between them before either could react. "Olivia!" Roderick's voice tore through the darkness, raw with a fear she had never once heard from him. "Go," she shouted back, already moving, already thinking, already refusing to become the reason he hesitated at the exact moment hesitation could cost him everything. "Find Cassian. I'll find my way to the others." She did not wait to hear his response, disappearing deeper into the passage before he could argue, guided only by the fragmented memory of the ancient survey and a desperate hope that her instincts would prove as reliable now as they had every other time this conspiracy had tried to destroy them. The passage led her, after several terrifying minutes of navigating by touch alone, into the castle's old armory, where she found 3 of Roderick's guards pinned down by a group of attackers who had clearly anticipated exactly this route of escape. Without time to think, only to act, Olivia seized a discarded blade from the wall and threw herself into the fight, every hour of training with Garrick suddenly rendered vividly, viscerally real. She was not skilled enough to win against 3 trained fighters alone, and she knew it, but she was skilled enough to buy the guards the precious seconds they needed to regroup, to turn the tide of a fight that had nearly been lost, and when the last attacker fell, Olivia stood amid the wreckage of the armory with her chest heaving, her hands shaking but alive. "My lady," one of the guards said, staring at her with something between shock and reverence, "we need to reach the Duke. Cassian's men are converging on the eastern tower." Olivia did not hesitate. "Then we move." They found Roderick in the castle's great hall, locked in single combat with Cassian himself, the 2 men circling each other with the particular terrible intimacy of family turned enemy, every strike weighted with years of buried resentment finally given permission to surface. "You were always the favoured one," Cassian snarled, his blade clashing against Roderick's with a force that echoed through the ancient stone. "The air, the golden sun, while I was left to build my own power from nothing but scraps and patience. You could have had a place at my side," Roderick said, blocking another strike, his voice raw with a grief that had nothing to do with the physical danger of the fight. "I offered you that, Cassian, more times than you deserved." "I don't want a place beside you," Cassian spat. "I want what should have been mine from birth." The fight surged toward a narrow balcony overlooking the castle's inner courtyard, and Olivia watched in horror as Cassian, sensing the tide turning against him, drew a second blade from his belt, its edge catching the torchlight with an unnatural oily sheen that could only mean one thing. "Roderick, the blade is poisoned." Olivia screamed, already running, already understanding with sickening clarity that she would not reach him in time through conventional means.
She did the only thing left to do.
She threw herself between them at the exact moment Cassian's poisoned blade descended, the strike meant for Roderick's heart instead catching her across the side, a searing line of agony that stole the breath from her lungs entirely. She heard Roderick's scream of her name, as though from a great distance, felt herself falling, felt the cold stone floor rushing up to meet her. But her sacrifice bought exactly what it was meant to buy. The single instant of shock at seeing Olivia intercept the blow was enough for Roderick's fury to fully ignite, and he moved with a speed and violence that ended the fight within seconds, disarming his cousin and pinning him against the balcony's ancient stone railing with a blade at his throat. "It's over, Cassian," Roderick said, his voice shaking with a rage he no longer bothered to contain. It was always going to end this way. "Then finish it," Cassian said, something broken and defeated finally surfacing beneath his practiced charm. "You've already lost everything that mattered anyway." Roderick's grip on the blade tightened, murder plain in his eyes, but the sound of Olivia's ragged breathing behind him shattered whatever fury had been building toward violence. "No," Roderick said, stepping back. "Death would be a mercy you don't deserve. You'll live to stand trial before the crown, to answer for Seraphine's murder and every conspiracy that followed, and you'll spend whatever years remain to you understanding exactly what you threw away." He turned from his cousin immediately, guards moving in to restrain Cassian as Roderick rushed to Olivia's side, gathering her into his arms with a desperation that stripped away every last trace of the cold composure the court had always known him by. "Stay with me," he said, his voice breaking entirely as he pressed his hand against the wound at her side, blood dark and warm against his fingers. "Olivia, please, stay with me." "I'm not going anywhere," Olivia managed, though her voice had grown faint, the edges of her vision beginning to blur. "Someone has to make sure you don't do anything else foolish. You threw yourself in front of a poisoned blade," Roderick said, something between a laugh and a sob catching in his throat. "You don't get to call me foolish." "Family trait," Olivia whispered, and then the world tilted entirely into darkness. She woke 3 days later in a chamber flooded with warm afternoon light, her side bandaged and aching but undeniably, gratefully alive. Roderick sat beside her bed, his appearance dishevelled in a way she had never once seen. Dark circles beneath his eyes, suggesting he had not left her side in all the time she'd been unconscious. "The physician says the blade missed anything vital by less than an inch," he said, the moment he noticed her eyes open, relief flooding his voice so completely it nearly broke on the words. "A few days more of rest, and you'll heal completely."
And Cassian?
"In chains, awaiting formal trial before the crown," Roderick said. His confession, once he understood the full scope of evidence against him, implicated 3 additional conspirators within the court, men who believed my growing influence threatened their own ambitions enough to justify murder. The steward who poisoned my wine cellar was one of Cassian's earliest recruits, promised relief from his family's debts in exchange for loyalty. The assassin at the ball was hired through intermediaries Cassian believed untraceable. Every thread, in the end, led back to the same source. And the note that framed me? Forged by a scribe, Cassian paid handsomely, using letters he'd stolen from the library correspondence you sent weeks earlier, Roderick said. "Exactly as you suspected. I should have trusted your instincts from the very beginning, Olivia, rather than allowing even a moment's doubt to take root. You trusted me enough, in the end," Olivia said softly. "That's what mattered." Roderick took her hand in both of his expression suddenly, uncharacteristically vulnerable. "I have spent my entire life believing that love was a weakness kings and dukes could not afford, that trust only ever led to betrayal, that the safest path was always the coldest one. You proved every one of those beliefs wrong, not through grand gestures, but through 100 small choices to stay, to fight, to trust me even when I gave you every reason not to."
Roderick.
"Let me finish," he said, something raw and determined in his voice. I don't know how to be the kind of man who says these things easily. But I know that the moment I saw that blade descending toward you, I understood with absolute clarity that I would rather lose every title and every alliance I've ever built than lose you. I love you, Olivia. Not the political convenience of you, not the useful ally of you. All of you. The forgotten daughter who refused to stay forgotten, who saw through every lie built around me, who chose to stand and fight when every instinct should have told her to run. Tears gathered in Olivia's eyes, warm and unfamiliar, the particular vulnerability of finally being wanted for nothing more than exactly who she was. I spent my whole life believing I was invisible, she said. That no one would ever choose to see me, let alone love me. You were the first person who looked at me and saw someone worth fighting for. Then let me spend the rest of my life proving that wasn't a mistake, Roderick said, and kissed her with a tenderness that held none of the desperate uncertainty of their first, and all the quiet certainty of a man who had finally stopped fighting what he felt. The formal announcement came 3 weeks later, once Olivia had fully recovered and the trials of Cassian and his co-conspirators had concluded before the full assembly of the court. Roderick stood before the same gathered nobles who had once whispered about the forgotten Ashworth girl with pity and contempt. Olivia at his side in a gown of deep sapphire silk that caught the light like something precious finally allowed to shine. Many of you believed, Roderick said, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall. That Lady Olivia's presence in my household was a scandal, a convenience, or a mystery to be solved. I stand before you today to correct that belief entirely. She is the reason I survived a conspiracy that would have destroyed this dukedom and everyone loyal to it. She is the reason justice has finally been served against those who murdered an innocent woman and betrayed this crown. And she will be my wife, my Duchess, and my equal in every sense the word demands. The court erupted into applause that felt, to Olivia, almost surreal after a lifetime of being overlooked, and as Roderick took her hand before the entire gathered nobility of the kingdom, she understood that the woman who had once believed herself invisible had finally, completely, been seen. Their wedding took place beneath a sky scrubbed clean of the storm clouds that had haunted every previous chapter of their story, and as Olivia walked toward the man who had once demanded to know who had sent her, only to discover, in time, that no one had sent her at all. She had simply chosen herself. She felt the full weight of everything that choice had cost and everything it had ultimately given her. Family was not always the blood that raised you, she had learned. Sometimes it was the people brave enough to choose you, again and again, even when choosing you was dangerous. Worth was not something granted by those who had spent a lifetime denying it. It was something claimed, quietly and fiercely, by anyone willing to stop waiting for permission to matter. And sometimes, the people the world teaches to disappear are the very ones strong enough to save everything worth saving.
If you've ever been told you were too much, or not enough, or simply not worth noticing at all,
Olivia's story is proof that the people who overlook you are rarely the ones who determine your worth. Tell me in the comments which moment hit you hardest. The diary in the forbidden library, the blade she took for him, or the words he finally found the courage to say. If this story found its way into your heart the way it found its way into mine, stay close, because the next forgotten soul is already waiting for her story to be told.